The Serpent Oracle, Templars, Mormons, and the Lilith Legacy. Up next, David Brody joins us. We hear so much about the serpent. I mean, we hear great things about a serpent. I mean, it's a symbol of medicine. It's a symbol of so many positive things. And then we hear it's the symbol of Satan, the devil. Who wins on this?
It's crazy. It's a crazy dichotomy because we don't glorify the spider, and we don't demonize the pony, but there's something about the serpent. Like you said, we have both good and evil. And that's really what got me going on this. The ancient peoples, if you go back in history and look at some of the idols that they use and the worshiping that they did, the ancient peoples almost universally worshiped the serpent. And yet today we think of it as this evil, a sign of the devil, the Garden of Eden story. And so which is it? Is it both? Is it one? Is it the other? And that's really what got me going on this. But again, we don't have the shark, for example. We demonize the shark. No one glorifies the shark. And yet the serpent, the snake, sort of falls in between, falls on both sides of the equation. If you go back, a lot of your listeners probably watch the ancient alien shows, but go back to Genesis chapter 6, and I'll quote, "And it came to pass that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them as wives." So in other words, the sons of God, some people interpret that as angels, came down to earth and took human women as their wives and had children. Other people say, wait, the sons of God, these people coming down from the sky, those weren't angels, those were aliens. They weren't coming down from heaven, they were coming down from stars, some alien star, some outer universal word, whatever. And so which is it? I don't know the answer to that. But if you look further at some of the language, for example, the Anunnaki, the Sumerians who call the sons of God the Anunnaki, meaning those who came from heaven. Mm-hmm. And then further on, in Hebrew, when these Anunnaki mated with the human women, they had offspring called Nephilim, from the Hebrew word nafal, meaning to fall. And so are these children who are the product of these aliens / angels and human women, are they falling from grace, or are they literally falling from the sky? So we see these hints in some of the language that's used that maybe there is something to this whole idea that this Genesis chapter 6 isn't talking about angels, but instead is talking about ancient aliens.
And then, of course, the great flood of Noah apparently was set up to kill off the Nephilim, wasn't it?
Right. There's a whole story about God decided that these people were evil. They were giants, and they were evil, and we need to wipe them all out, and maybe they didn't all get wiped out, and that whole thing is another aspect to that. But if you go back and look at some of the statues and figurines, there's a fascinating one that was found in the city of Ur, which is in Mesopotamia, with southern Iraq, today's Iraq. It's at the Iraq Museum. It dates back to about 400 BC. It's a human body with a snake head, and that was one of their gods. What better way to illustrate this whole concept of serpent aliens mating with human women than to have a figurine or a statue or a god that is half human, half serpent, that they are a reflection or an echo of what the ancient people believed happened in their past. If you look at the various cultures that have, for example, serpent worship, it's incredibly widespread. Not only in Mesopotamia, there's this fascinating, I love the Asherah goddess statue, Asherah being the equivalent of Isis, basically, but she's standing there with bare-breasted, and in each hand she's got these snakes wriggling in her hand. And, of course, we know about Cleopatra and the asp, how Cleopatra worshipped the snake. And that happens in Mesoamerica with the Aztecs and Quetzalcoatl, and with the Maya and Kukulkan, the Khmer of Cambodia. It happened in serpent worship in India. There's a fascinating serpent mound in southern Ohio. It's a quarter-mile long. And, again, the Native Americans apparently were worshiping the serpent as well. So we see this all across on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, both hemispheres. And to me, if we have that much serpent worship and it's that universal, there was something going on that caused it. It's hard to believe that this kind of thing independently bubbled up in so many different cultures like I said, independently. That's just not the way that usually works. Usually there's some kind of common truth, common thread to all this that causes that kind of widespread universal behavior. We always want to imitate our gods. So we'll get to it later. There's this whole thing about lots of ancient cultures deformed the skulls of their babies to make them look more serpent-like.
That's right. They kind of elongated them, right?
Elongated them. Yeah, we see that not only in Mesoamerica with the Mayan culture. We see it Nefertiti, for example, the famous bride of King Tut. We see it in Egypt. We see it on the Isle of Malta. We see it even today in southern France, the city of Toulouse in southern France. There's still vestiges of that. So there's that possibility, the idea that the snake worship comes from that. We always want to imitate our gods, and we believed in this, and so that's what we did. It's also possible just that the snake is such a powerful thing that we worshipped it because of its power and its ability to shed its skin and rebirth itself, reincarnate itself, and so immortality, the symbol of immortality. So it may have nothing to do with this ancient aliens. It may just be that we've been so fascinated by the snake because of so many cool characteristics that it has. But I think it's probably the first. I think it's probably that there's vestiges of this memory of the ancient aliens.
Is the serpent been given a bad rap, in your opinion?
Yeah, very much so. I think that when you think about the things that it actually symbolizes, which is both wisdom and power, it's a very, I think the Cleopatra worship of the snake, of the asp, where in the end Cleopatra commits suicide by letting the snake bite her.
It bites her, right.
It's a noble way to die. There's a whole nobility and almost reverence for the snake. That's what the ancient people really believed, and it's funny because that sort of carried through. There are fascinating groups of fundamentalist Christians in Appalachia who handle snakes. They believe it's ordained in the New Testament that they're supposed to do this, and you can go into these churches. And they literally have bags of rattlesnakes that they'll dump on the floor, and they'll start praying and dancing and singing, and one by one the parishioners will grab hold of these snakes and hold them up.
Yow. You've written a lot about the Knights Templars. Do they play a role in some of the serpent worship?
Yeah, so that's really what got me going on this to begin with. The very first time I sort of looked at this, the Templars, most of your listeners probably know, they were a secret organization, a secret society, the fighting monks, the army of the medieval church. But because they were secretive, they had these special secret seals they used for their correspondence. They were also early bankers, so of course the seals were very important for that. But some of their seals, even though they were the army of the church, they were Christians, they were monks, had some really interesting pagan imagery. In particular, there was one seal that had an image of a pagan god named Abraxas, Abraxas. In fact, the word abracadabra is believed to derive from Abraxas. And Abraxas was this figure that was half serpent or snake and half human. And again, it's a pagan deity. But it struck me as like, where did that come from? And then as I got deeper into the research about the possibility of serpent aliens, I saw that figurine I described earlier, the one that was found in Iraq, that's in the Iraq Museum, that's half snake and half human, which is very similar to the Abraxas. I'm like, well, wait a second. That's really what's going on there. Is this Templars seem to have figured out or discovered or learned about this ancient tradition of these serpent aliens. People forget that the Templars, even though they were based in Europe, they spent a lot of their time in the Middle East. And during that time period, we're talking early 1100s, early 1300s, when the Templars were finally disbanded and outlawed. But during that time period, Europe was the backwater, and the Middle East was the heart of intellectual discovery and education. And so people from Europe who went to the Middle East came back with all this knowledge. So I think one of the things that happened is the Templars went to the Middle East, were stationed there, and came back with lots of knowledge that the church didn't want shared, and that eventually that's why the Templars were outlawed. The church finally said, okay, enough of this free thinking, enough of this modern thinking, enough of all this idea of the sun being the center of the universe. We can't have that. And so they eventually put the Templars down. But I think part of that whole thing was the Templar discovery of this ancient serpent alien issue.
Mm-hmm.
It manifests itself in some of their secret seals. For example, Abraxas, the union of the man and the reptile, is a metaphor for this whole fallen angel thing. And so, starting with the Templars, and then, of course, whenever you start with the Templars, you eventually end up with the Freemasons, because many historians and scholars, including myself, believe that the Freemasons, after the Templars were disbanded, the Freemasons sort of became a reconstituted version.
Right. They're basically the offshoots of the Templars, aren't they?
Exactly, and carried that forward. And even in Freemasonry, we have some of these interesting symbols. They have something called the brazen serpent ritual. This goes back to, I mentioned it earlier, where Moses put up a post and a serpent on it, and people who looked on that serpent would be cured. But this idea of the serpent being part of one of the Masonic rituals. And in my book, The Serpent Oracle, the main antagonist in the story is a Freemason who decides he wants to try to take over Freemasonry and make it a group of serpent worshipers, sort of under the umbrella of Freemasonry. And this actually is based on something that happened in the real world, something that started in the Philippines and made its way to California. This group of Freemasons who had a subgroup known as the Grand and Glorious Order of the Knights of the Creeping Serpent.
Jeez.
And this idea that the serpent is somehow to be admired and revered. But in my story, the trigger for the whole thing is this Masonic character who wants to have Freemasonry go back to the idea of being serpent worshiping.
And the Knights Templar, they were the holders of the Shroud of Turin, weren't they?
Possibly, yeah. That's one of the things that they were believed to have. One of the big mysteries is, what did the Templars discover when they were in the Holy Land back in the early parts of the 1100s that made them so incredibly powerful so quickly? They became the wealthiest, most powerful force in all of Christendom for about 200 years. Did they discover the Ark of the Covenant? Did they discover the Holy Grail? What was it that they discovered? Was it treasure? Was it the Templars came back and said, hey, look what we learned? And then the other side of that coin is, what was it 200 years later that finally had the church say, enough, we've put up with you guys long enough, we're done with you, even though you're our fighting force, and even though for 200 years you fought the Crusades on our behalf, we can't have it anymore. We're done with you. You're too much of a loose cannon. We're worried you're going to reveal things you shouldn't reveal. No one's quite sure what those two things were. The thing that happened in the early 1100s and the thing that happened in the early 1300s. It's probably the same thing, but what that secret was. And no one's been able to quite figure out what it was. But one possibility is this whole idea of serpent DNA. There's a fascinating book, and I went deep into it in a previous novel, talking about the passages in Genesis. It's called the Genesis 6 Conspiracy by a guy named Gary Wayne. And he goes into that, and he basically divides the world into good and evil based on who survived during the Great Flood, aliens or not. This is based on whether it was Cain or Abel, and he tracks this whole thing. But his point basically is, and we see this manifesting itself a little bit today.
Tell us about the cover of the Serpent Oracle book.
So that is the cover is the all-seeing eye surrounded by the classic Ouroboros idea of a snake swallowing its own tail. And that is inspired by a real symbol that I found that was used in Freemasonry. So again, the all-seeing eye, of course, you see it on the dollar bill, and everyone knows it's the triangle with the eye inside. It's a Masonic symbol. But I was surprised, and this goes back to an earlier question you asked, do the Templars, do the Freemasons have a history of serpent worship? And it's there, but it lies just below the surface. But I found this image of, again, a Masonic image of the all-seeing eye surrounded by the serpent. Symbolically, the serpent encompasses and surrounds everything the Masons do. And I thought it was a cool cover image.
Oh, it is. It's well done.
Yeah, thank you. But again, in Freemasonry especially, everything's symbolic. Everything has many levels of meaning. It's a secret society. It's a society with secrets. And I one of the things I love to do, I'm not a Freemason myself, but I love to sort of try to figure out what it is they're trying to tell us without actually telling us.
What would you like people to bring away with themselves after they read the Serpent Oracle?
The whole idea that, A, we may actually descend from serpent aliens, which I think is, on its surface, an outlandish idea, but when you look at it more carefully, there's a decent amount of evidence to support it. So that's sort of fun to think about. So that's one possibility. But I think even more fundamentally, the idea that the ancient peoples may have been closer to sort of universal truths and universal knowledge than we are today. I think that's the thing I want people to think about when they read this book in particular.
David, do you think the serpent has gotten a bad rap?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the serpent historically has been associated with knowledge and wisdom. The church didn't want that, didn't want its flock to be educated. And so anything associated with knowledge was considered undesirable, and that's where the association came. But, again, the snake is just a snake. It does what it does to survive.
Do you believe in the Bible?
So I've always felt that the Bible is a compilation of ancient legends passed down. But if you ask me if I believe that the Bible is sort of a sacred word of God, no. But I think it's a compilation of ancient stories and legends and myths that were passed down over the millennia. I did want to make the point, we talked about it earlier, the idea that the Freemasons sort of inherited the mantle of the Knights Templar. One of the pieces of research I just learned about, which I wanted to share, was that the cornerstone for the White House was laid by George Washington, and that was done on October 13th, 1792. And, of course, October 13th is a very famous day in Templar history. That's the day the Templars were put down, October the 13th, 1307. We know that George Washington, when he laid that cornerstone, was wearing his Masonic apron. I don't think that was an accident that they chose the date of the Templar put down to lay the cornerstone for what was going to be the New Jerusalem here in America. So I think that's just another piece of evidence that sort of ties the Freemasons to the Templars, this whole continuum. But I don't think that date was an accident.
I don't think so either.
Well, it was described to me once by a senior-level Freemason who said that the difference between established religion, particularly the Catholic Church, and Freemasonry is that the Church believes that humankind, men, whatever, are naturally evil and need religion to be made good. And the Freemasons believe that man is naturally good.
I would agree with them, don't you?
Yes, I do, and I think that, and I love the fact that they are so egalitarian. I love the fact that there's a great story about, I believe it was President Truman, who was a Freemason, and his gardener happened to be the master of his lodge, and Truman would always defer to the gardener whenever he saw him, because in the Masonic lodge they both belonged to, the gardener was senior to Truman, and so I love the fact that in the Masonic lodge, any person, no matter their status in society, can rise up to be the master of the lodge. There's a lot of things that Freemasons do that I think we could learn a lot from.